Detective Sarah Langford leaned back in her chair, her eyes fixed on the ornate black card on her desk. Silver script invited her to a special Halloween tour of Alcatraz Island. The card was elegant, almost anachronistic, and its mysterious allure was hard to resist. Alcatraz, known for its infamous history as a maximum security prison, had been closed to the public for years. Now it was reopening for one night only, promising a spine-chilling experience. Sarah's thoughts were interrupted by the shrill ring of her phone. She picked it up, recognizing the number immediately. It was her old friend, Mark Davis, a historian with a particular fascination for Alcatraz. "Sarah, you have to come to this tour," Mark's voice crackled with excitement. "I've been digging into some old archives and found evidence of strange occurrences on the island. I think something big is about to happen." Strange occurrences? Sarah's interest was piqued. She had always been a skeptic when it came to the supernatural, but Mark's enthusiasm was contagious. Yes, unexplained disappearances, sightings of ghostly figures, and even some rumors about dark rituals performed by the inmates, Mark continued. "It's more than just a ghost story. There's something sinister at play, and I need your help to uncover the truth." After a moment's hesitation, Sarah agreed. The prospect of a night on Alcatraz, combined with Mark's intriguing findings, was too compelling to pass up. She checked her watch and realized she had just enough time to prepare before heading to the pier. As the sun dipped below the horizon, Sarah made her way to the ferry dock, the city lights of San Francisco twinkling in the distance. The air was crisp, carrying the scent of salt water and anticipation. She spotted Mark waiting, a thick file of documents under his arm, and a look of excitement mixed with trepidation on his face. "Glad you could make it," he greeted her with a hug. "I've got a feeling tonight will be one for the books." The ferry ride to Alcatraz was enveloped in an eerie silence, the thick fog swallowing the sound of the waves crashing against the hull. Detective Sarah Langford and her friend Mark Davis stood at the bow, the looming silhouette of the prison island slowly coming into view. The small group of invited guests around them whispered nervously, their breath visible in the chilly night air. The boat docked with a gentle thud, and the group disembarked, their footsteps echoing eerily against the wooden planks. As they made their way up the narrow path towards the prison entrance, Sarah took in the surroundings. The island was bathed in an unnatural, ghostly light, and the oppressive silence was occasionally broken by the distant cry of a seagull. Emily, the park ranger and their guide for the evening, greeted them at the entrance with a forced smile. Her demeanor was professional, but Sarah could sense a hint of nervousness in her eyes. "Welcome to Alcatraz," Emily said, her voice barely above a whisper. "Tonight we'll be exploring parts of the prison that have been closed off for years. Please stick together and follow my instructions." As the group entered the prison, they were immediately enveloped by the cold, damp air. The heavy steel door clanged shut behind them, sealing them inside the notorious fortress. Emily began the tour, leading them through the main cell block, her flashlight casting long shadows on the walls. "This is cell block B," Emily explained, her voice echoing in the vast empty space. "Home to some of the most infamous criminals in American history: Al Capone, George Machine Gun, Kelly, and Robert Stroud. The Birdman of Alcatraz, all spent time here. Sarah listened intently, her eyes scanning the darkened cells. Each one seemed to hold a story of its own, and the weight of history pressed down on her shoulders. She could almost hear the faint clinking of chains and the distant murmurs of the prisoners who once inhabited these grim cells. Mark stayed close, his nose buried in his thick file of documents. "I've been researching some of the inmates who were here," he whispered to Sarah. "There are countless reports of unexplained phenomena, ghost sightings, strange noises, and even violent encounters." "Violent encounters?" Sarah raised an eyebrow, her curiosity piqued. "Yes," Mark replied, his voice serious. "Some guards reported being attacked by unseen forces, and there are records of inmates who went mad, claiming they were tormented by spirits." The group moved on to the mess hall, where Emily continued her narration. "This is where the prisoners ate their meals. It was a place of tension and violence, with frequent fights breaking out. Some say the walls still echo with the sounds of those altercations." As they walked through the mess hall, Sarah felt a sudden drop in temperature. She shivered, pulling her coat tighter around her. Mark noticed her discomfort and handed her a small charm. "It's a protective amulet," he explained. "I thought it might come in handy tonight." "Thanks," Sarah said, pocketing the charm. She wasn't one to believe in superstitions, but given the circumstances, she appreciated the gesture. The group continued their tour, passing through the warden's quarters and the infirmary. Each room seemed to carry an air of lingering despair, and Sarah couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched. She glanced over her shoulder more than once, convinced she saw fleeting shadows moving in the periphery of her vision. Finally, they reached the solitary confinement area, known as the Hole. Emily paused at the heavy door, her hand trembling slightly as she turned the key. "This is where the most violent and disturbed prisoners were kept," she said, her voice barely audible. "Many of them never made it out alive." The group stepped inside, the oppressive atmosphere almost palpable. The narrow corridor was lined with small claustrophobic cells, each one a testament to human suffering. The lights flickered, casting unsettling shadows on the walls. As they walked through the hole, Sarah felt a cold breeze brush past her, sending a shiver down her spine. She heard a faint whisper, almost like a breathy exhale, but when she turned, there was no one there. Her heart pounded in her chest, and she glanced at Mark, who looked equally uneasy. "Do you hear that?" she whispered, her voice trembling. Mark nodded, his eyes wide with fear. "It's starting." Before Sarah could ask what he meant, the lights flickered again, and a low, guttural moan echoed through the corridor. The group froze, their faces pale with terror. Emily tried to maintain her composure, but the fear in her eyes was evident. "It's just the wind," Emily said unconvincingly, her voice shaking. But Sarah knew better. This was no ordinary wind. Something malevolent was stirring within the walls of Alcatraz, and they were about to face a nightmarish reality far beyond their wildest fears. The atmosphere in the solitary confinement area was suffocating. The narrow, dimly lit corridor seemed to stretch on forever, each step echoing off the cold, unforgiving walls. The guests huddled closer together, their fear palpable in the stale air. Detective Sarah Langford's instincts were on high alert, every nerve in her body attuned to the slightest sound or movement. As Emily, the park ranger, nervously continued her explanation of the brutal conditions inmates faced in the hole, the group shuffled along, peering into the tiny, dark cells. The flickering lights cast long, unsettling shadows, and the temperature seemed to drop even further. Suddenly, the lights flickered violently, plunging the corridor into darkness for a brief moment. A collective gasp rippled through the group. When the lights came back on, the atmosphere had shifted. It felt heavier, charged with an unseen presence. Sarah felt a chill run down her spine as a low, guttural moan echoed through the cell block. She turned to Mark, who was gripping his protective amulet tightly, his face pale. "Did you hear that?" she whispered, her voice barely audible. Mark nodded, his eyes wide with fear. "That's not just the wind," he muttered. Before Sarah could respond, the sound grew louder, more distinct. It was a haunting wail, filled with anguish and torment. The guests looked around frantically, trying to locate the source of the sound. Emily tried to maintain her composure, but her trembling hands betrayed her fear. "We need to keep moving," Emily said, her voice shaking. "This way." As the group proceeded deeper into the solitary confinement area, the temperature continued to drop and the moaning grew louder. Sarah's breath came in visible puffs, and she could see the fear etched on the faces of the other guests. They reached the end of the corridor where a large, heavy door loomed ominously. Emily hesitated before opening it, her hand trembling as she fumbled with the key. The door creaked open, revealing a small, cramped cell. The air inside was thick with the stench of decay. "This is one of the most notorious cells," Emily explained, her voice barely above a whisper. "Inmates who were sent here often reported seeing things. They claimed to be tormented by visions and voices." As the group peered inside, Sarah felt a sudden rush of cold air. She turned, her flashlight beam sweeping across the cell, illuminating the damp, moldy walls. In the corner, she saw something that made her heart skip a beat. A shadowy figure, barely visible, but undeniably there. "Did you see that?" she whispered urgently to Mark, who was standing beside her. Mark nodded, his face pale. "Yes, I saw it." Before they could react, the lights flickered again, plunging them into darkness. This time, the darkness seemed to stretch on forever. The air was filled with the sound of frantic breathing and the soft shuffling of feet. Suddenly, a blood-curdling scream pierced the silence. It was one of the guests, a middle-aged man who had been standing at the back of the group. The lights flickered back on, and Sarah saw the man being dragged into a cell by an unseen force. His eyes were wide with terror as he struggled against the invisible grip. "Help me!" he screamed, his voice filled with desperation. Sarah and Mark rushed forward, but as they reached the cell, the door slammed shut with a deafening clang. They could hear the man's screams from within, growing fainter by the second. "We need to get out of here," Mark said urgently, his voice shaking. "Whatever is happening, it's getting worse." Emily, now visibly shaken, tried to regain control of the situation. "Everyone, stay close and follow me. We need to get to the administration building. It's the safest place." The group hurried back down the corridor, their footsteps echoing in the eerie silence. As they passed each cell, Sarah couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched by unseen eyes. She glanced over her shoulder repeatedly, convinced that shadowy figures were lurking just out of sight. When they finally reached the administration building, Emily locked the door behind them, her hands trembling. The group huddled together in the dimly lit room, their faces pale and drawn with fear. "We need to find a way to contact the mainland," Emily said, her voice trembling. "The ferry isn't due back for hours, and we can't stay here." Sarah's mind raced as she tried to come up with a plan. She knew they needed to stay calm and think rationally, but the fear in the room was almost tangible. She could feel it pressing down on her, threatening to overwhelm her. "We need to figure out what's causing this," she said, her voice firm. "Mark, you mentioned something about dark rituals. Could that be connected to what's happening?" Mark nodded, his face serious. "I've found records of inmates who were involved in occult practices. They believed they could harness supernatural powers to escape or gain control over others. It's possible that they succeeded, and now their spirits are trapped here, seeking revenge." Sarah took a deep breath, trying to steady her nerves. "Then we need to find a way to break whatever curse or ritual they performed. It's our only chance of getting out of here alive." The group looked at her, their fear mingled with a glimmer of hope. They knew that their survival depended on uncovering the dark secrets of Alcatraz and putting an end to the malevolent forces that haunted its halls. The nightmare had only just begun, and they had a long, terrifying night ahead of them. The administration building, once a place of authority and order, now felt like a fragile refuge against the mounting horror outside. Detective Sarah Langford and the group of terrified guests gathered around a large wooden table cluttered with old documents and maps. The dim light of the flickering lanterns cast eerie shadows, accentuating the fear etched on every face. Emily, the park ranger, took a deep breath and tried to steady her trembling hands. "We need to stay calm," she said, her voice wavering. "There's a radio in the control room. If we can get it working, we can call for help." Sarah nodded, her mind racing. "Mark and I will go to the control room. The rest of you stay here and try to barricade the doors. We don't know what we're dealing with, but it's clear that these spirits are dangerous." Mark grabbed his file of documents, his face grim. "Let's go," he said, leading the way down the narrow hallway. As they made their way to the control room, the building seemed to come alive with sinister sounds. The walls creaked, and distant whispers echoed through the corridors. Sarah's flashlight flickered, casting long shadows that seemed to move on their own. They reached the control room and found it in disarray. Old equipment was scattered across the floor, and the air was thick with dust. Mark quickly located the radio and began fiddling with the dials. Come on," he muttered, trying to get a signal. Sarah kept watch at the door, her eyes scanning the dark hallway. Her heart pounded in her chest, and every creak and whisper set her nerves on edge. Suddenly she heard a soft, almost inaudible sobbing. She turned, her flashlight beam cutting through the darkness, but saw nothing. "Mark, hurry," she urged, her voice tight with tension. "I'm trying," he replied, his frustration evident. "This equipment is ancient. It's going to take a minute." As Mark worked on the radio, Sarah felt a cold breath on the back of her neck. She spun around, her flashlight illuminating a spectral figure standing in the doorway. It was a woman, her face twisted in anguish, her eyes hollow and dark. "Help me," the ghostly figure whispered, her voice filled with despair. Sarah's breath caught in her throat. "Mark, we've got company," she said, her voice barely a whisper. Mark glanced up, his eyes widening in fear. "Keep it away from me," he pleaded, his hands shaking as he continued to work on the radio. The ghostly woman stepped closer, her form flickering like a candle flame. Sarah felt an overwhelming sense of sorrow and pain emanating from the apparition. She took a step back, her mind racing. "What do you want?" she asked, her voice trembling. "Release us," the ghostly woman whispered, her voice echoing in the confined space. "We are trapped, suffering." Before Sarah could respond, the ghostly figure vanished, leaving behind a chilling silence. Sarah's heart raced, and she turned back to Mark. "Did you hear that?" she asked urgently. Mark nodded, his face pale. "I think they're trapped here because of those rituals. We need to find a way to break the curse." Finally, Mark managed to get a signal on the radio. "This is Alcatraz Island. We are in need of immediate assistance," he said, his voice shaking. "We are under attack by supernatural forces. Please send help." Static crackled through the speaker, followed by a faint, distorted voice. "Message received. Assistance is on the way. ETA 2 hours." Sarah let out a sigh of relief. 2 hours. We just need to hold on for 2 hours. They returned to the main room, where the others had managed to barricade the doors with furniture. Emily looked up, her face filled with anxiety. "Did you get through?" "Yes," Sarah replied. "Help is on the way. We just need to survive until then." Suddenly, the building shook violently, and a deafening roar filled the air. The guests screamed, and the lights flickered, plunging the room into darkness. Sarah's flashlight revealed the source of the noise. Ghostly figures emerging from the walls, their faces contorted with rage and sorrow. The group huddled together, their fear palpable. "What do we do now?" one of the guests cried, tears streaming down her face. Sarah took a deep breath, trying to steady her nerves. "We need to find the source of the curse," she said, her voice firm. "Mark, do you have any idea where the rituals were performed?" Mark nodded, flipping through his file. "According to the records, there's an old chapel in the basement. That's where the most powerful rituals took place." "Then that's where we need to go," Sarah said, determination in her eyes. "It's our only chance to end this." The group made their way to the basement, the air growing colder with each step. The walls seemed to close in around them, and the distant whispers grew louder. They reached the old chapel, a small, decrepit room filled with symbols and strange markings. "This is it," Mark said, his voice trembling. "This is where the rituals took place." Sarah scanned the room, her flashlight revealing a dusty altar covered in old, tattered books. She picked one up and began to read, her eyes widening in realization. These are incantations. They were trying to summon something, or someone. Suddenly, the room grew unbearably cold, and the ghostly figures reappeared, their faces twisted with anger. "You cannot stop us," they wailed, their voices echoing off the walls. Sarah felt a surge of determination. "We have to break the curse," she said, her voice firm. "Mark, Help me find the right incantation." Together they flipped through the books, searching for the ritual to reverse the curse. The ghostly figures closed in, their cold, spectral hands reaching for the group. Sarah's heart pounded in her chest as she found the incantation. "This is it," she said, her voice filled with urgency. "Everyone, stand back." She began to recite the words, her voice strong and unwavering. The air crackled with energy, and the ghostly figures screamed in anguish. The room shook, and a blinding light filled the space, forcing Sarah to shield her eyes. When the light faded, the ghostly figures were gone. The room was silent, and the oppressive atmosphere had lifted. Sarah took a deep breath, relief washing over her. "We did it," Mark said, his voice filled with awe. "We broke the curse." As they made their way back to the main room, the group felt a sense of cautious optimism. They had faced the horrors of Alcatraz and survived. The nightmare was over, but the memory of that night would haunt them forever.